My wife's family humiliated me for being poor. Now their million-dollar company needs my help to survive. I, 35M, never thought I'd be writing this. But after what happened at last week's family dinner, I need to get this off my chest. My wife comes from what you'd call old money, the kind of family that has a summer house in the Hamptons and throws charity galas. I, on the other hand, grew up in a small apartment above my parents' hardware store. When we first started dating 6 years ago, I knew her family wasn't thrilled. They were polite enough, but there was always this undercurrent of disapproval. My father-in-law would make these subtle jabs about my humble beginnings, while my mother-in-law would helpfully send me links to job postings at her friends' companies, suggesting I should aim higher than my construction consulting business. I took it all in stride. I had built my business from scratch, and while it wasn't making millions, it was honest work. My wife always stood by me, telling me to ignore them. But last week, everything came to a head. It was supposed to be a regular family dinner at their mansion. My wife's brother had just been made CEO of their family's development company, and everyone was celebrating. The wine was flowing, and that's when my father-in-law started getting loose with his words. "You know," he said, looking directly at me across their mahogany dining table, "some people just don't have what it takes to succeed in this business. They're content with small-time operations." The way he said it made my stomach turn. My mother-in-law chimed in. "Darling, we're just concerned. How will you provide the kind of life our daughter is accustomed to?" She turned to my wife. "Remember when you had to cancel your spa membership because of budget concerns?" I sat there, gripping my fork, as they continued their thinly veiled insults. My wife's brother was smirking, champagne glass in hand, probably thinking about the multi-million-dollar projects he was now in charge of. The worst part? My wife just sat there, staring at her plate, saying nothing. What they didn't know was that earlier that day, I had received an email that would change everything. A major tech company was planning to build their new headquarters, and they were looking for construction consulting firms. The project was worth more than all of my previous contracts combined. I had spent months preparing for this bid, working late nights, researching sustainable building practices, and developing innovative cost-saving measures. My small team and I had poured everything into this proposal. As my in-laws continued their subtle barbs about my quaint little business, I thought about the USB drive in my pocket containing the final proposal. The irony? The tech company had specifically requested smaller, innovative firms over large corporations. They wanted fresh perspectives and hands-on management. I excused myself from the table, citing a work emergency. As I walked out, I heard my father-in-law mutter something about unreliable small business owners. My wife followed me to the door, asking if everything was okay. I just told her I had some work to finish. That night, I stayed up putting the final touches on my proposal. My wife came home late, probably after getting an earful from her family about her poor choice in husbands. She tried to apologize for her family's behavior, but I was too focused on my work to really talk. The next morning, I submitted the proposal. Then came the waiting game. For 2 weeks, I threw myself into other projects, trying not to obsess over the bid. My wife and I barely talked about the dinner incident. She was busy with her own work, and I was consumed with keeping my existing projects running smoothly. Then yesterday, my phone rang. It was the tech company's project manager. As I listened to him speak, my hands started shaking. We had won the bid. Not only that, but our innovative approach to sustainable construction had impressed them so much that they wanted us to consult on their future projects as well. But here's where it gets interesting. After I hung up, I received another call. This time, it was from a friend in the industry. He told me something that made everything click into place. The family company, the one my brother-in-law had just taken over, they had bid on the same project. Not only had they bid, but they had been counting on this contract to pull them out of some serious financial troubles. I'm sitting in my office now, staring at the signed contract. The same contract that could have saved my in-laws' company. The same company that had been hemorrhaging money due to mismanagement and outdated practices. The same company that my brother-in-law was now desperately trying to save. Tomorrow is another family dinner. My wife doesn't know about the contract yet. Neither does her family. I'm wondering how they'll react when they find out that the small-time operation they've been mocking for years just won the contract that could have saved their company. I spent the whole day at work trying to decide how to handle the dinner. My team was celebrating the contract win, but I couldn't fully join in. Every congratulatory email and handshake just reminded me of what was coming. By late afternoon, I still hadn't told my wife. The drive to my in-laws' house was tense. My wife kept glancing at me, probably wondering why I was gripping the steering wheel so tight. I had dressed up more than usual, a crisp suit I usually save for client meetings. She noticed, raising an eyebrow but not saying anything. We arrived at their house just as the sun was setting. The massive iron gates opened automatically, a reminder of the wealth I'd apparently failed to provide. My father-in-law's collection of luxury cars lined the circular driveway. I parked my modest sedan between a Bentley and a Mercedes. The atmosphere inside was different from last week. Gone were the champagne bottles and celebratory mood. My brother-in-law looked stressed, his designer suit slightly wrinkled, his phone constantly buzzing. My father-in-law's usual commanding presence seemed diminished. He barely looked up when we entered. Dinner was served in their formal dining room, but the usual chatter was replaced by an uncomfortable silence. My mother-in-law tried to maintain normalcy, asking about everyone's week in her practiced hostess voice. That's when my brother-in-law's phone rang again. He excused himself, nearly knocking over his wine glass in his hurry to leave the room. I could hear his muffled voice from the hallway, getting increasingly agitated. When he returned, his face was pale. He whispered something to my father-in-law, who immediately set down his fork with a clang. "We'll discuss this later," my father-in-law hissed, but the damage was done. My mother-in-law was already asking what was wrong, her perfectly maintained facade cracking slightly. That's when I decided to speak up. "I actually have some news of my own," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. All eyes turned to me. My company won a major contract this week. The tech company headquarters project. The silence that followed was deafening. My brother-in-law's face went from pale to red. My father-in-law's hand tightened around his wine glass, so hard I thought it might shatter. That's impossible," my brother-in-law stammered. "They were supposed to announce next week." "They called yesterday," I replied, taking a sip of water. "Apparently, they were impressed by our innovative approach and sustainable practices." My wife turned to me, her eyes wide. "Why didn't you tell me?" Before I could answer, my father-in-law cut in. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice was low, dangerous. "That contract, we needed that contract." "I know," I said simply. My mother-in-law's silverware clattered against her plate. "You knew? You knew we were bidding on it." "I found out after we won," I explained, keeping my voice level. "But isn't this what you wanted? For me to aim higher?" My brother-in-law stood up abruptly. "This is a joke. A small firm like yours can't handle a project of this scale. You'll crash and burn." Actually, I pulled out my phone and opened my email. They specifically chose us because we're small. They wanted personal attention, innovative solutions, and hands-on management. Everything your company's too big and set in its ways to provide. My father-in-law slammed his hand on the table. "You listen to me, boy. That contract could save our company. We're talking about hundreds of jobs, decades of legacy. You can't possibly understand what's at stake." I looked him straight in the eye. "I understand perfectly. I understand that you've been running your company the same way for 30 years, refusing to adapt. I understand that you've been losing clients because you won't embrace sustainable practices. And I understand that you've been too proud to admit any of this." My wife grabbed my arm. "Is this true?" she asked her father. "Is the company in trouble?" The look on my father-in-law's face shifted from anger to something else, desperation. My mother-in-law started dabbing at her eyes with her napkin, her perfect makeup beginning to smear. "We could work together," I said, surprising myself. "My team has the innovation and fresh ideas your company needs. You have the resources and experience we could use. A partnership could benefit both of us." The room fell silent again, but this time it was different. My brother-in-law had sunk back into his chair, looking defeated. My father-in-law was staring at me with an unreadable expression. My father-in-law cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "A partnership?" he repeated, as if testing how the words felt in his mouth. His eyes narrowed. "And what exactly would this partnership look like?" I pulled out my tablet and opened the project outline I'd prepared just in case. I'd spent the entire day working on it, hoping for exactly this opening. "Your company has the infrastructure and workforce we need. We have the innovative approaches and sustainable practices that clients are demanding now. Together, we could dash." "This isn't a boardroom," my mother-in-law interrupted, her voice sharp. "This is a family dinner." "No," my wife suddenly spoke up. "This is exactly what we need to discuss." She turned to her father. "Dad, how bad is it?" "Really?" The facade finally cracked. My father-in-law seemed to age 10 years in 10 seconds as he slumped in his chair. "We've lost 3 major contracts this year. Clients keep talking about green initiatives and sustainable practices, things we've always considered trendy nonsense." He shot me a look that wasn't quite as hostile as before. Obviously, we were wrong. My brother-in-law ran his hands through his hair. "The board is meeting next week. Without this contract." He trailed off, the implications clear. I opened the project presentation on my tablet. "Look at these numbers," I said, sliding it across the table. "This is what we could do together. My team handles the innovative design and sustainable practices. Your company handles the construction and implementation. We both bring what we're best at to the table." My father-in-law picked up the tablet, his reading glasses perched on his nose. The room was silent except for his occasional mumbling as he swiped through the slides. Finally, he looked up at me. You prepared all this today? After winning the contract. I nodded. I've been watching your company's struggles for years. I never said anything because, well, you made it clear my input wasn't welcome. But I've always known our companies could complement each other perfectly. My wife reached under the table and squeezed my hand. I squeezed back. And if we refuse? My brother-in-law asked, but there was no fight left in his voice. Then I wish you the best of luck, I replied honestly. But this contract is just the beginning. The industry is changing. You can either change with it or become obsolete, my father-in-law finished. He set the tablet down and looked at me. Really looked at me, perhaps for the first time. You're not the person I thought you were. No, I agreed. I'm not. He was quiet for a long moment, then turned to my wife. Your husband is either very smart or very foolish, offering to help the people who've done nothing but look down on him. He's smart, my wife said firmly. He's always been smart. You were just too proud to see it. My mother-in-law dabbed at her eyes again, but this time I don't think it was for show. My brother-in-law was already pulling out his phone, probably to call an emergency board meeting. We'll need lawyers, my father-in-law said finally. And a proper meeting, with all the paperwork. I have a draft agreement ready, I replied. His eyebrows shot up, and for the first time, I saw a hint of respect in his eyes. The rest of dinner was strange. Not exactly comfortable, but different. My mother-in-law asked genuine questions about my business for the first time. My brother-in-law admitted that some of our previous projects had caught his eye. My father-in-law mostly listened, occasionally nodding. As we were leaving, my father-in-law pulled me aside. I still don't like that you're not from our world, he said gruffly. But maybe that's exactly why we need you. That was as close to an apology as I was going to get, and I accepted it with a nod. On the drive home, my wife was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said, you could have let their company fail. After how they treated you, nobody would have blamed you. I could have, I agreed. But that's not who I am. She smiled and took my hand. No, it's not. And that's why I married you. It's been a week since that dinner. The lawyers are drawing up the partnership agreements. My father-in-law actually called me yesterday to discuss some ideas. My brother-in-law has been sending me their previous project files, asking for my input on how to modernize them. Things aren't perfect. Years of condescension and hurt feelings don't disappear overnight. But there's a respect there now that wasn't there before. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to build something new on. As for my wife, she canceled her spa membership again last week. But this time, it wasn't because of budget concerns. She said she'd rather invest the money in our company, our future. I think that says everything about how things have changed.